Hello class. So for this final presentation, I decided to focus on the area of project stakeholder management. Now, some of the questions we might be asking ourselves is what are stakeholders, right? Stakeholders are pretty much any person that is affected by the project or project activities. Um, they usually have a stake in the work, and they can also influence the ability to fulfill, the project's mission. Uh, these usually include, for example, project managers, project sponsors, the project team, users, um, and it pretty much goes to say that there's two parts to stakeholders or two separate entities, which are internal and external stakeholders. So, internal stakeholders pretty much are usually part of the organization, um, and they're they directly affect the the project the project direction, and they pretty much are the primary stakeholders that organizations focus on. Uh, for example, employees, project managers, the board of directors, and so on. Now, external stakeholders are usually, pretty much a group of individuals that aren't necessarily working for the organization. Instead, they're often impacted by the project activities, and as a result, their impact is indirectly affecting the project. Um, and these can include suppliers, customers, and I believe competitors as well. Now, moving on to our third topic, what does stakeholder management consist of? Well, it primarily consists of these four different areas within this section, which is identify the stakeholder, planning the stakeholder engagement, managing stakeholder engagement, and monitoring stakeholder engagement. So, to properly identify a stakeholder, we first need to do a few things, right? Uh, the, uh, One of the things you need to do is to pretty much go over the project documentation. You want to go ahead and look for specific business units that are going to be impacted by the project, right? By the specific project. Um, and pretty much you could go down from there. Once you specify a business unit, you can then go ahead and look at some of the people that work within that unit and kind of sort of prioritize who's going to be uh, who has a higher influence within that business unit, right? um, Also, you can also pull the team members that you gathered and start brainstorming ideas in order to effectively identify stakeholders. Also, one thing I want to note for identifying stakeholders is that you can use a power interest grid. So basically, a power interest grid is, as the name says, it's a grid. On one side you have the power, and on the bottom you have the interest grid. Pretty much some of the things that you want to include in that interest grid is unaware, resistant, neutral, supportive, and leading categories. Now, usually you come together as a team to kind of score the stakeholders, right? So let's just say that a stakeholder got a 7 for interest and an 8 for power. You're gonna want to manage them closely because they potentially have high power and high interest, right? So um, that's one way to identify stakeholders. Another one is to use a stakeholder register. Pretty much for this, you go ahead and based on the I'm going through the specific business unit that is affected by the project, you're going to go ahead and pretty much start listing names. You write their positions, whether they're internal or external. What are their project roles, right? So that's one way to, start keeping track of them, and then you're going to want to go ahead and do that power interest grid, as I mentioned before. Moving on to our next topic, managing stakeholder engagement. So managing stakeholder engagement is important because you wanna make sure things are going nice and smooth throughout the project, right? So what are some of the ways you can do this? Well, I think some of the ways you can do this is by using a expectation matrix. Now, what this is pretty much, it's a grid. You just list down. It's made up of 4 columns as measure of success, priority, expectations, and guidelines, for the most part. Now, in measures of success, you can put things down like time, cost, and in the priority section, you can pretty much use a score of 1 through 4. Now, 1 being the highest priority, 4 being the lowest priority. Now, as an example, let's just say we needed to we needed to redesign a website by next week, right? Now, our priority for the measure of success with time would be 1, because we've been given little time to redesign the website, right? So that should be one of our main priorities. Now, moving on to the next one, which is monitoring stakeholder engagement. Pretty much some ways you want to monitor stakeholder engagement is by kind of setting the tone for communication, right? You want to be professional in all of your communication. You don't want to treat them like friends or anything like that, because then problems occur and stuff like that. So that's something you want to make sure of right off the bat. Now, some of the ways you can monitor them is through planning a way of communication such as email or instant messaging, right? Especially in an agile environment, you're going to want to communicate with your stakeholders directly and at a short notice, right? Because basically agile is pretty flexible, right? It's fast paced. You're gonna want to know of issues or if any changes right away, so you don't start moving on to the next level of the project, right? The next iteration, if you will. Now, if we move on to this slide, what other ties does stakeholder management have to different areas? I chose these 3: project resource management and project risk management, as well as project scope management, because I think those are the 3 areas that stakeholder management affects the most. So project scope management gets affected by this area because you will need to be engaged to the stakeholders in order to provide a scope management plan that will satisfy the primary stakeholders, and that way you'll be in time for your deadlines and other areas. Now, for project risk management, having a close relationship with stakeholders and being able to identify your stakeholders goes hand in hand with risk management, because once you know what stakeholders you have and what kind of interest and power they have, they're pretty much going to be able to help you out with any risk associated with the project. For resource management as well, you'll be able to kind of get a clue once you identify your stakeholders, how much resources you will need. For example, you know, how many, if a stakeholder says that you're gonna need somebody else, you're gonna count that into project resource management, because then you'll have an extra hand, if you will. So here are some of the tools that you can use for stakeholder management. As I said before, there's a power interest grid. Right here is a good example of what I said. The power is on the left and the interest is at the bottom. Now here's the stakeholder analysis, which is usually used in project in managing engagement. You can see here the different fields, such as the benefits, contributions, and sacrifices, and the influence that they have. And here are some of the stakeholders that can be listed as an example. Another one we have is expectations matrix. It's another good tool to use. Now, they aren't just restricted to these tools. They can also use tools such as instant messaging, right, such as email, chats, right? But one thing you want to take into consideration within this agile methodology is that you need to have access to your stakeholders directly, right? Because in other implementations, such as the waterfall method, you kind of have to go through management first before you get to engage with that stakeholder. So in an agile environment, everything is a little bit more fast paced, so you need to get faster decision making, and you can't have faster decision making if you don't do it directly with the stakeholder. Okay, now that was all I had for you guys, so thank you very much in following with me, and have a great day. Thank you.